In this episode,
If you don't take care of yourself, you can't have healthy relationships with others. I'm a firm believer in that. If you don't, you know, say, you know what, it's okay for me to go and have lunch with a friend, as opposed to making dinner for your or having lunch with your significant other. The world's not going to end. He's a grown man. He can make a sandwich for himself. So,
And when I was growing up, like that really resonated with me, and that was one of the things that made me think, yeah, this religion is the right one. It's better than all these other Christian religions that believe that, people.
Sprinklers are about to come on.
Dang it! I was right in the middle of a point too. Are we gonna have to move before your tripod gets?
We'll see. We might have to stop for the sprinklers.
It's gonna sprinkle on you here. Dang it!
We can always edit this later, so no worries about that. That might be interesting to some of our audience. I mean, how something like suicide could be selfish. So maybe if you could elaborate a bit on what you mean by that. You're destroying yourself, so what could be more unselfish than that?
I'd like to jump in on that.
Welcome to another episode of the Selfishness Project, where we explore the idea of selfishness. Today, or I should say tonight, I am here with two new guests.
Faith.
Faith and
Ash.
Ash. Okay. I know both of them, at least a little bit, from having met with them in previous years, but let me not assume my prior knowledge for our audience. So, Faith, let me start with you.
Okay.
So, when I say the word selfishness or selfish, what comes to mind? Anything in particular?
Well, I'm in a place where I'm learning different things about selfishness, and I grew up believing that selfishness is a bad thing, where you're doing things that specifically just focuses on you and not taking anyone else into account. But as I get older, I'm learning, and I'm also learning that selfishness can also be about making you a focus, not to the exclusion of others, but so that you are able to take care of yourself. So
Okay, so you started out, as I think a lot of people do, with this negative kind of view of selfishness, and I guess you're now starting to think of it in a different way. What is it that has led you to start thinking of it differently than you used to think about it?
actually, it's therapy. Just going for personal therapy and spending time with psychologists and everything, and they're like, you need to do some self-care. You need to take care of yourself, and it's okay to say no if it's not serving to what's good for you, what's good for your life. And I started going along that path pretty much because I was spiraling and couldn't keep up with taking care of everyone else except for me.
Okay, it's interesting you mentioned this term self-care. I've heard that come up a few times talking to people about selfishness, but it seems like it's become more prominent recently, I take it. So do you study psychology, and have you heard it that way, or?
Like I said, I have heard it, and just studying and going to school and picking up also a lot of the self-help books that have been coming to light, a lot of the new direction that people are looking on how to take better care of yourself. And like I said, just even going to therapy for myself to work through, the transitions of my life. So when I hear it from my therapist and they're like, what have you done for yourself this week? As opposed to, you have to care about what everybody else has thought or what everybody else is doing. And, that's when self-care popped up. I had a hard time with that when they would ask me, what have you done for yourself this week? And for a long time I was just like, nothing. And then finally I was just like, well, I know I couldn't afford it, and I had this bill to pay, but I decided I wanted to get my nails done. And they were just like, and how did that make you feel? It's like a little anxious about not paying that particular bill and putting it off a couple of days, but it was nice to have time for myself and just to focus and be able to breathe and say, I did something for me, and the world's not going to end. So that was just how self-care um, came into being for me.
Okay, so then trying to connect that to selfishness, in my mind, I guess being given this advice by psychologists or therapists or whomever that it's okay to care for yourself, is that basically another way of saying it's okay to be selfish to an extent? Is that kind of how you interpret it? And that's why, like, now you have a different view of selfishness, someone than you used to?
Absolutely. I hear the analogy. It's like, oh, you should, like when you're on an airplane and they teach you, you need to put the oxygen mask on your face first before you can help anyone else. I feel that that's part of that selfishness um, that people are viewing, and you can take that and put that. If you yourself are not happy, how can you expect the people around you to be happy? And if you are taking care of yourself, if you're taking that time to, take an hour to read a book instead of, you know, going out and doing something for someone else, and it's pushing your day and everything else, and it becomes a domino effect. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't have healthy relationships with others. I'm a firm believer in that. If you don't, you know, say, you know what, it's okay for me to go and have lunch with a friend, as opposed to making dinner for or having lunch with your significant other. The world's not going to end. He's a grown man. He can make a sandwich for himself. So, and if I come home and I'm happy and I said, I just spent time with this person and it was really fulfilling to me, I can now smile and take care of him and, not necessarily take care of him because he can take care of himself, but I can be a better partner. I can be a better friend. I view that you can be a better parent, better, you know, just a better person in general. Um,
Can I add to that?
Please.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, because she did that the other night, she went and had dinner with a friend, and, and if she takes time and does things for herself and she comes home and she's happier, and I should be happy for her as well, that's, better for both of us and for our relationship, right? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely.
So her being selfish or self-caring is actually, in a way, it's, I don't know, is it other caring? Does it include your own well-being? There's no, I'm getting the sense there's not a conflict here.
Exactly.
When she's doing what's good for herself, it's good for
right.
the both of you somehow.
Yeah, because, the way I think of it is, we are social animals. In some ways, we're the most social animals. We have, these incredibly complex social relationships. And to a large extent, what an individual self-interest consists in is, those relationships with other people, because, that's how we thrive as a species and as individuals, is through exchanging these different values with each other. It's like we're social animals in a way that's different from the way that, like hive insects are. We don't have the same kind of, or even, like other social animals, like other mammals, like wolves, or, we don't have the kind of top-down dominance hierarchies, at least ideally. I think we don't, we have these mutually beneficial kind of win-win relationships.
Mm-hmm. I want to get a bit of your background. So we're in Utah right now, and there's this is the land of the Mormon Church, and I understand you have some backgrounds.
Yeah, I grew up here. Faith is not from here, so she's not from a Mormon background, but I am.
Okay. Yeah. So in your backgrounds as a Mormon or growing up in a Mormon area, like, how does selfishness relate to that? Does it come up at all? If so, how? Does anything come to mind in terms of like thinking about your history and background that connects to selfishness?
Yeah, and Mormonism is kind of a unique animal in terms of its relationship to other Christian religions in this country, I think. So in some ways it's similar, in other ways it's quite different. And I think basically it's pretty similar with regard to this issue in terms of, like she was saying, I was definitely brought up to think that, selfishness was wrong, and like the good is to, be altruistic in this sort of Christian sense of, you should be, I'm trying to think of the best way to put it, not even just like kind of like the Old Testament idea of, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, which, kind of implies that you want other people doing good things for you as well. So there's kind of almost like a self-interested aspect to that, but almost in this kind of more extreme Christian sense of like, turning the other cheek, and, if your enemy takes your, you probably know the Bible references better than I do anymore, but, if your enemy takes your cloak, give him your shirt also, or something, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of stuff. So, but at the same time, so Mormons do at least pay some lip service to that kind of idea of altruism. But, like most other more mainstream Christians, they don't take it too seriously. Because, they'll say, you should turn the other cheek and stuff, but in practice, how many of them really do that consistently in the way that Jesus would probably want them to? So I don't know, there's a lot of interesting kind of conflict there, I think.
Yeah. Mormonism, that's a religion that it was born in America, is that correct?
Yeah, so it was started in the kind of early to mid 19th century. So Joseph Smith, the founder of the religion, kind of came out of upstate New York, and then they just kind of, as the movement grew, it kind of gradually migrated westward, and then, Joseph Smith was martyred in Ohio or wherever, and, Missouri, I guess. They were kind of like in that area, Midwest, and then, his successor, Brigham Young, ended up leading the early Mormons out here to Utah. But I think the fact that it is an American religion that kind of came out of that, what is that, the Second Great Awakening or whatever, the history of religious development in this country. I think that's relevant because, there are certain aspects of Mormonism that I think are sort of more individualistic or almost self-interested than some other, kind of more traditional Christian or Protestant or even Catholicism.
Yeah. I'd be interested to hear about that.
Sure, yeah. Like just the first example that comes to mind is, they have what they call their Articles of Faith, which was at one point, Joseph Smith was kind of asked to boil down what are the basic doctrines of Mormonism, and so he came up with this list of kind of 13 key principles that he called the Articles of Faith, and one of them was, it might be the first one, I don't remember the whole list anymore, or the order, but one of them was that, they believe, and he's trying to distinguish his doctrines from the other Christian religions at the time that he thinks are wrong, that he's starting this new religion to kind of correct, what he thinks is wrong with the kind of Protestant tradition at the time. And so one of them is, we believe that man will be punished for his own sins and not for Adam's transgression. So it's sort of like an explicit repudiation of the idea of original sin. Mm-hmm. And when I was growing up, like that really resonated with me. And that was one of the things that made me think, yeah, this religion is the right one. It's better than all these other Christian religions that believe that, people...
Sprinklers are about to come on.
Dang it, I was right in the middle of a point, too. Are we going to have to move before your tripod gets...
We'll see. We might have to stop for the sprinklers.
It's going to sprinkle on you here. Dang it.
We can always edit this later, so no worries about that. All right, so you were talking about the differences between the Mormon religion and the other religions, and that the Mormon religion is, in a way, it's more individualistic because you're not responsible for Adam's sins, but only your own sins, or something like that, and that it was more appealing to you.
Yeah.
For that reason.
Yeah, and so then when I, So I always thought, it's like, well, this is the true church, and if I ever left this church, I wouldn't join a different Christian faith that had that idea of original sin, because I think that's definitely wrong. Because I thought it was just totally unfair for, somebody to be held responsible for the actions and choices of somebody else, right? But then, ultimately, that is actually why I ended up leaving the Mormon church, because I realized that, despite, the claim of that particular article of faith, that they do still hold this doctrine of original sin in some form, because the whole idea of Christ dying for everyone's sins is still basically that idea that one person can take on the responsibility of the choices and actions of someone else. And in this case, it's like the one supposedly perfect person is the one who's going to be responsible and take on the suffering and punishment and everything for the sins of everybody else. And I was like, wow, that's the idea of original sin on steroids, because it's not just that the descendants are responsible for Adam's transgression. It's like, no, it's like the one guy who never did anything wrong now, for that very reason, is the one guy who has to suffer for everything that wrong that anybody else did. And when I kind of thought of it that way, that just struck me as like so completely, like monstrously unjust, that I was just like, I can't ascribe to that anymore. It's like, I don't want Jesus to suffer for my sins. I want to be responsible for my own choices in life, And then it's just, and you can follow that line of thought and just be like, okay, and all right, so does that mean that, if God, the rest of it is true and God is real and the afterlife and everything, that, all right, so I'm gonna have to suffer for my own sins if I'm not accepting Jesus's atonement. But then the idea that means like, oh, and that means I'm gonna like have to suffer eternal damnation and torture in hell for however long, like for whatever stupid things I did in this life, that doesn't make any sense to me. Like, that just seems completely unfair. And so, once I kind of let all that go, to kind of bring it back around to the idea of selfishness, it was much easier for me to just start looking at life as like, I should just be trying to live the best life that I can and enjoying it. And if I make mistakes along the way, okay, I may have to pay for them, but like hopefully I can learn from them. And yeah, just all of that whole religious dogma about afterlife and sin and punishment and hell and all of that stuff just seemed completely unnecessary.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up this point about paying for other people's sins. Like, I hadn't really thought as explicitly in my mind before that, in a way, it's a collectivist philosophy. I mean, I've heard it said that Christianity, in a way, it values the individual soul, but in a way, it's kind of so in some sense, it's individualistic, perhaps, because each individual, whatever rank he has in life, whether he's the king or some serf, he's got some soul which has some specialness in God's eyes or something. But so maybe there's some element of individualism in Christianity, but there's also an element of collectivism, because Jesus is bearing other people's sins, not just his own, and we're bearing Adam's sins, not just our own.
Yeah. And as a congregation, the people in the church, and I think this is probably true of most Christian sects, like that you have some responsibility for the other people in your congregation in terms of like, you're all in it together, right? Like, you're supposed to be making sure that, your family and your neighbors and everybody else are on the right path too, which is why I think a lot of Christian denominations, especially the Mormons, they proselytize a lot, and they have missionaries that go out because like they're on a mission to save other people's souls. Like, that's very unselfish, right?
Other oriented, for sure.
Yeah.
So Faith, I guess, do you have a Mormon background as well?
No, I grew up in the Pentecostal church. And we, like he said, that the idea, we believed in original sin. So I grew up being told that you were born in sin and then but there was an age of accountability. So you don't like after a certain point, that's when God holds you accountable for whatever. And I always struggled with that because I'm like, well, what age are you accountable for what you do? So that was something that I struggled with growing up and thinking about. But the idea of missionaries being a mission, we're taught, go ye therefore into all the world and preach the gospel to every nation. Like that's something you're taught to do. You're taught to go out. You're taught to teach other people because it's your responsibility to make sure that any person that you come into contact with takes responsibility for their sins, their actions. And then you're also responsible for your sins and your actions. And, if you see your, brother sinning, you need to let them know, hey, this is not okay.
Yeah, well,
So
Cain
that's
and Abel,
kind of,
right? Am I my brother's keeper?
right. So these are all things that I grew up hearing as well. That is a fundamental difference, about the age of accountability. But
We have a version of that in Mormonism too, because Mormonism kind of comes out of that tradition of Protestantism where they don't believe in infant baptism that the Catholic Church does, and so that's kind of baked into the whole Protestant tradition, I think, where it's just like, children are held to be innocent up to a certain point when they reach an age of accountability. But then even in Catholicism, they have, what they call the age of reason, which is, I don't know, 7 or 8 or something. Julia Sweeney, I don't know if you've ever seen Letting Go of God,
Yeah,
Julia Sweeney's monologue. She has a really funny bit about that, so for people who haven't seen that, you should check it out. But I don't know, it's just like, I feel like the more you dig into these religious edifices, they're very complicated and they get very messy, and they're very contradictory in a lot of ways, I think. But so yeah, I mean, you could dig into the kind of minutia of these all day and try to tease apart, like what's going on in different traditions.
But it's interesting that you asked me because I think back to when I was in church and everything, and one of the things that I always thought was interesting is it's a lot of work trying to make sure you yourself haven't sinned. So, but then you have to go out and do that. So even if you try to take that selfish model and say, or self-care model, well, I'm trying to do my best. I'm trying to lead the life that God wants me to lead. It almost makes it impossible because if you do that, that's wrong. How, like, you can't focus on yourself, even trying to get do your best, make sure that you're not sinning, make sure that you're leading the life God wants you to lead. You have to make sure other ones, because that's part of that's part of what God is asking you to do. So it's almost in a place where it makes it impossible for you to do that self-care, even saying, hey, I'm trying to make sure that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, to be, you know to lead a righteous life, to be one without sin, to make sure that, yes, that's important, but you're responsible for other people too, which sends you down a spiral, which it almost makes it impossible. Uh, that's kind of something that I struggled with, and I had trouble when it came to church, um, and thinking about that. So I guess it's kind of, it sets you up for failure for that self-care model. So even once I left church, I didn't know how to separate that. I didn't know how to separate that from my everyday life. I would have, the idea that I would take an hour for myself when there are other people who need my time. The idea that I wouldn't drop everything so that I could help someone else, help a friend. Uh, I struggled with that idea, and I didn't know how to separate that, which is part of why I ended up doing therapy. And, you know, it was such a struggle for them to get me to do something that was just for me, even if it was something very small, that didn't take a whole lot of time. But the idea of doing that was difficult for me, and a part of that comes from how I was raised and that belief system, because that was something I always struggled with. How can I keep on top of myself, which is a ton of work, and then also make sure that my brother isn't, falling behind, or my sister isn't falling behind. We call each other brother and sister in church. I know that may sound weird, but that's what we did.
Yeah,
and
Mormons do that too.
and so, like, or if you and you work so hard and you work there and you don't want to fail that person. So once you leave that church and you've got that mindset, it makes it very difficult for you to lead a good, your best life. It makes it hard for you to lead, the life that is fulfilling, that makes you feel like you've done something that's productive, and it makes it difficult to make you feel like you can succeed at anything, because you need to make sure that the people around you are doing that, doing as well. So,
Can I add to
Yeah.
that? I think that brings up a really huge issue here with how that kind of belief system that's based on a more sort of altruistic ethic that requires you to be more focused on other people's needs and to the exclusion of your own. I think it's really common for it to have like really serious mental health implications, and especially here, like Utah has some of the highest rates of just prescription of psychological medications, for depression and stuff, but also like abuse of prescription drugs and suicide as well, especially among groups that are sort of cast out by the mainstream community here. There's been a real crisis over the last decade or so here with gay teens who are basically disowned by their parents and end up living out on the streets, becoming homeless, and then killing themselves. It's really tragic, and I don't know. It makes me think of something else that Faith has mentioned to me before, though, about in a sense, selfishness is sort of like at some level, it's like a biological imperative, where living organisms just have this hardwired urge to preserve their own life, right? And other animals don't attempt suicide, but humans can take this higher level perspective on their lives and actually make that choice consciously, and to do that, to choose to decide to take your own life is, from one perspective, it's kind of the most unselfish act that you can do, right? But from another perspective, in some contexts, if somebody is choosing to end their life because they just can't handle the level of pain or suffering that they're dealing with anymore, or whatever, like that can even be a selfish choice. I think so.
That might be interesting to some of our audience. I mean, how something like suicide could be selfish. So maybe if you could elaborate a bit on what you mean by that. You're destroying yourself, so what could be more unselfish than that?
I like to jump in on that. I have suffered with mental health issues, it wasn't just therapy. I've been hospitalized for it, and because of multiple suicide attempts. And one of the things, one time I went on Facebook and someone was going off about how suicide's the most selfish thing, and it really upset me, because I thought, here's the thing: when I have done this, my thought wasn't just, yes, it wasn't a selfish thought, and even then they looked at it as a bad thing, like this is a selfish thing. When it was always trying to make things better for other people.
Suicide was making things better for other people.
Because I felt like a burden. I felt like I was just having to struggle with that and looking at it, and I'm just like, you would be better off without me. I'm making your life better by taking me out of the equation. You wouldn't have to deal with the stress. You wouldn't have to deal with my anxiety. You won't have to do this. You, it's actually quite, it's one of the, it's almost, it's not a self, in my view, it's not a selfish act. It's one, in my personal experience, it's always been to, I'm doing this because I'm causing pain to other people. How can I make their pain stop?
Right. Like everyone would be better off without me. I'm a burden. But and I think that's a common view, because I mean that goes back to, like, you know, even portrayals in the media, like back to It's a Wonderful Life. You know, Jimmy Stewart, he jumps off the bridge because he thinks that, you know, like his life is meaningless, and nobody would miss him if he were gone, and like he's just a drain on his family and his friends or whatever. And then the whole point of the movie is, like, you know, how that's not actually true, and you know,
Right.
how he's made like such a big difference in the world. You know, and, like we don't need to debate the merits of that movie here, but I think it's interesting, you know, that that's the way it portrays that choice, because I think that is actually kind of a common
But
way that people think of it.
but one of the things that I have is getting back to a healthier mindset is taking on the selfish view. And that's, I'm not worried about what other people do, because now I know that when I feel this way, I can go and I'm going to drive for the weekend and take the weekend for myself and visit people that are self edifying, that feed into me, and I can take that selfish choice and do that. I might give a gift to a person not because I have to, not because it's their birthday and it's required, not because it's just the social convention. It's because I've taken the time to see the smile on. I'm having a bad day. I'm going to go to a bookstore and buy Ash a book that I think he would appreciate. And to see the look on his face, that makes me feel good. And so to me, that was my selfish choice, and that makes me feel good to do that. And I've noticed that my mental health has gone from, I'm trying to make everyone happy and do exactly what everything wants, and now I can't do it. And this is just, going from one extreme to, I'm actually healthier by taking those selfish choices. And somebody's like, you just picked up and left and didn't think about anyone else? Yes, you're right. I did just pick up and leave and didn't think about anyone else because I wanted to feel good. I wanted to do something that was good for me. And I didn't want to be in a place where I would hurt myself. So it's kind of funny that, like, the world sees, well, suicide is a selfish option. In my view, it wasn't. I was doing it to help you. And then when I decided to take that, I'm going to do my self care, I'm going to do what's best for me, I'm going to do what's selfish, and I'm in a better place mentally than I have been in years.
Hmm. So there's some interesting things that came up there. One is that generosity, like you're buying of him a book, gives you some kind of satisfaction, whereas often people think, well, doing something for others is altruistic. You're not getting anything out of it yourself, but here it seems like you were.
Mm-hmm.
Also, so the suicide. So I guess in your case, it was kind of, I guess, it was coming from an altruistic source. You were wanting to lessen the burden on others, whereas other people were telling you that it's selfish. Like, what do you suppose? Do you have any idea of why they might have thought it was selfish?
They view, and I have gotten their view, and a lot of it's just like, you're not thinking about what happens to us when you're gone.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, no, I'm thinking, that's exactly what I'm thinking about. And in the end, you'll get over me. You'll move on.
Hmm.
Life will, you think, I was like, because this is so like a fresh wound, you think I'm super important, but in the end, I can guarantee in 3 months you're thinking about something else, and I'm the last thing on your mind. So people view it as, you have to carry the burden. I'm like, you don't know my relationship with my family. Like, what will your family think? I'm like, my family doesn't think about me now. Like, these are things that, when you're looking at these things, I'm not saying all my family doesn't think about me, but this is the situation. I don't come from a very close family. So would they really miss me? Well, we've gone years without talking, so not really. Like it I'm just taking up space. I'm just, that's just kind of how I felt about it. And, these are people that I talk on Facebook about. People say, well, you have all these friends and they like all your topics on Facebook. And I'm just like, but when was the last time someone called? That's just so when I take myself out of the picture, and because when you do call, I'm calling with high anxiety, I'm calling with super depression. I mean, dealing with bipolar disorder or dealing with any type of mental health disorder, it is hard. I like bless him because I know what it's like to deal with me. Are you kidding me? I know it drives you up a wall. Imagine what it does to me. I'm the one that's going up, down, left, right and can't figure it out. And at the same time, that's exactly when I get into that trap of look at what I'm doing to him. When we're in the same room and I can't handle things and I can't get my medications right and they need to be changed and it's not easy to get them changed. Like when it starts a slippery slope and it starts not working, I have to be in the doctor's office immediately saying, this is not working, we need to change it now before it gets too bad. And I become manic or I become super depressive because I cycle through both and he's got to deal with that.
Okay, so maybe we can get your perspective on
Well,
this.
I mean, she's making it sound like our relationship is like this constant dealing with those kinds of issues. But to go back to what she was saying a little bit before, with people who are suicidal feeling like, oh, I'm just removing a burden from all these people in my life or whatever, is when you have this view that your primary value is coming from your relationship with other people, I think that's kind of like almost a natural conclusion, is to then be like, well, if I don't see that I'm really giving that much value to other people, then why am I even here, right? Whereas on the other hand, I feel like when you're in a more positive relationship, which is actually what our relationship is most of the time, which is why we're together, like it's more about the things she was talking about, where you're doing things for the other person that are actually helping, contributing to their happiness, like buying them a thoughtful gift that they will enjoy, or just spending time together and doing the things that people do.
So when you get that gift, like when she gets you this book,
Mm-hmm.
what is your reaction? Like, do you say, "Oh, thanks for that was a selfless thing of you to do," or how do you see that?
No. To me, it just.
Was she being selfish when she did that, or self-caring, or how do you see that?
That's a good question, because I don't know that I really even kind of think of it in those terms. It's more just like, I feel like she knows me well enough to get me something that I wouldn't necessarily have gotten for myself just because I don't think about it. But when she gets it for me, I'm like, oh, this is great. I love it. And I assume that her intentions and her motives aren't to be, doing it out of some sort of self-sacrificial thing, like, oh, I could have bought myself a book, but I'm going to buy this thing for you instead. There's sort of, in a relationship, especially like a close, intimate relationship, there's sort of kind of quid pro quo, I guess, going on, where it's just like, we do things for each other because we love each other, and that kind of enhances both of our happiness at the same time. Because it goes back to what you said earlier, is that there's just not a conflict there.
This conversation kind of reminds me of the episode of Friends. Huge Friends fan, so it makes me laugh every time. And I love this episode. And Joey turns around to everyone and he's just like, well, there's no unselfish act. And he's trying to explain that to him. And then he goes on TV and he's doing like this telethon, and Phoebe's like, I hate PBS because, I wrote to them and they never wrote me back after, my mom killed herself. and so I won't do any. She's like, I'll show you. I'm going to do something. She's like, I've been saving up for this hamster, and I'm donating all this money to them, and it puts him on, and it puts him on TV, and she's just like, oh my God, I'm so happy. And she's like, no, and she's just upset because she was doing something she absolutely thought she was going to hate, and then it ended up that it was a happy thing. So I laugh at that episode every time because I'm a firm, like, it was enlightening when I saw that episode. Friends is enlightening. But it made me laugh because I'm a firm believer in that. Like, giving that gift, doing something for someone else makes me happy. I don't do it because I have to. I do it because I get to. I do it because I want to. And just having that sort of perspective in life, it changes your viewpoint. It changes your perspective. Like, to me, it makes life happier. And
changing the viewpoint on,
as opposed to
saying,
I
like,
have
there's
to do
not
it.
a conflict, like you're not doing something where you're benefiting other people at your own expense, but that rather that you're in these kind of mutually beneficial relationships.
Right. I'm giving to you because it makes me feel good. I'm not doing it because I have to, because someone told me to. I'm doing something for you because, and I think that when you take religion out of it, for me, like, circling back, when I took religion out of it and there wasn't a God telling me, oh, you have to do this, it made doing things for other people so much more um, rewarding for me, because then I realized I'm
'Cause
doing,
it's not a duty.
yeah, it's not something I have to do. It's something I get to do, I want to do, and it's self-care. It's selfish for me. So,
Maybe there's a tie in there to a political sort of issue, being forced to give money to some cause versus voluntarily donating money to some cause.
Yeah.
You might feel a lot better about where your
Yes.
money is going if you're not forced at gunpoint,
Yeah.
under threat of taxation.
We were talking about
Absolutely.
this a little bit at dinner before the interview, where, so you're not a Harry Potter fan, but
Well, I just don't know about it.
for all
I'm
the
not
Harry
that
Potter
advanced.
fans in here, Faith is a Slytherin. So, but I think you're right, Dan, that just in general, there's sort of an aspect of human nature where people resist being told what to do to some extent. If it's like explicitly, somebody coming and saying, you must do this just because I said so. A lot of people are gonna bridle at that, if that's the word I'm looking for, but because like, people value their own autonomy, and so even if it's something that you would have otherwise decided to do yourself, the fact that somebody else is saying you have to do it almost makes you not want to do it.
Yeah.
Right? Although on the other hand, like, and maybe this is to again bring it back around to the kind of religious thing, like, for a lot of religions, and for Mormonism explicitly, obedience is the highest virtue. So it's almost like, is this the whole point of religion, to try to overcome that natural self-assertiveness that people have, so that we can have these sort of hierarchical societal institutions where we can have somebody at the top, like, telling everybody below, this is how you should behave. I don't know, but yeah, nowadays I think of it as, I tend to kind of approach this whole question from a more, well, I already mentioned some of, like, biological aspects, but also just kind of like a game theoretic perspective. So are you familiar with game theory?
A little
at
bit.
all? So like the prisoner's dilemma kind of things,
Yeah.
and things like that. And I think people who study game theory, they'll set up experiments and things to try to show that, like, well, if you're selfish in the sense of, like, you're always just taking what you can get at the expense of everyone else, that actually has a bad outcome for everyone overall, kind of in the long run. And I think that's true if that's what you mean by selfishness. But something that I've never really heard discussed, that I think is kind of even more obvious and more profoundly true, is if you just look at altruism from a game theoretic perspective, if everybody were altruistic all the time and sacrificing their own interests for everybody else, that's not even a zero-sum game. That's a negative-sum game. Like, you cannot grow the pie by everybody just sacrificing for each other, right? And so, I think the conclusions that have kind of come out of game theory over the last several decades, kind of support the view that actually, a lot of what we've been saying, that if you view the situation as that there's not a conflict of interest and people kind of cooperate for a common goal, that everybody can end up actually being better off. And so in a sense, like, the selfish or self-interested thing to do is to cooperate with other people to kind of further your mutual goals, as long as they don't conflict with each other, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of Adam Smith's point of, when everyone pursues his own private interest, it's best for everyone as a whole.
Right.
So through the invisible hand of the market or something, just by being selfish or self-interested, that ends up actually maximizing everyone's interests.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a question of whether that should be one's motive,
Right.
to maximize everyone's interests. But there's not necessarily a conflict between pursuing what's in your interest and what's good for everybody else. It could be that what's best for you is also best for everyone else. It increases the pie, as you were saying. It
Right.
expands the pie.
Right.
All right. Well, any last thoughts, or is that big pies is a good place to end?
I
We
like
can all
pie.
Enjoy the pie. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Enjoyed
Thanks,
the
Ted.
chat.
It's fun talking to you.